The summit of Mount Hermon sits at 9,232 feet above sea level on the Syria-Lebanon border, sealed behind a United Nations buffer zone established in 1974 that prohibits civilian access to its upper coordinates. The Aramaic fragment, catalogued as 4Q201, stored at the Shrine of the Book in Jerusalem, names this exact peak as the location where 200 beings swore a collective oath before descending. Then something happened that changed history. When the Book of Enoch was removed from the biblical canon, every one of those named beings was gradually reduced to a single figure, Satan. One name, no rank, no origin, no structure. What the Book of Enoch actually describes is something entirely different. A hierarchy, an origin, and a role that bears almost no resemblance to the devil most people have been taught to imagine. The Book of Enoch was declared non-canonical at the Council of Laodicea in 364 CE. Banned, buried, called theologically dangerous. The official objection was its material on the Watchers, the ranked celestial hierarchy Enoch names individually. For 15 centuries that removal held. Then in 1947, a Bedouin shepherd threw a stone into a cave above the Dead Sea and heard ceramic shatter. Among the scrolls recovered from Qumran were fragments of 1st Enoch, radiocarbon dated to at least 200 BCE. Fragment 4Q201 alone carried portions of the 6th chapter in Aramaic, naming Simjaza, naming the mountain, naming the oath. These were not copies of a marginal document. They were source material, older than any New Testament text, preserved independently of the Ethiopian tradition that held the complete manuscript. The primary manuscript evidence for this passage runs through two independent lineages. Fragment 4Q204, excavated at Qumran Cave 4 in 1952 and currently held at the Israel Antiquities Authority in Jerusalem, contains Aramaic text from the 10th chapter of 1st Enoch that names the imprisonment decree for Azazel and confirms the structural hierarchy above him. The complete Ge'ez version exists in Ethiopian manuscript MS Qumran 9, housed at Qumran Gabriel Monastery on Lake Tana, and in the Oxum collection translated by Dr. Ephraim Isaac for the 1983 Oxford Annotated Bible. Drive Michael Knibb, whose 1978 Oxford Critical Edition remains the standard scholarly reference, identified the chapters describing the hierarchy above the Watchers as among the oldest strata of the entire Enochic tradition, predating the later narrative sections. This is not fringe text. It is the core. Here is what the text actually says. The Hebrew word Satan is not a proper name. It is a title. The term means adversary, accuser, one who opposes. In the oldest Hebrew legal usage, a Satan is a prosecutorial figure in the divine court, the being designated to bring charges, to test, to accuse. 1st Enoch preserves this function with a precision that later theology eliminated. Chapter 40, verse 7 of the Ge'ez manuscript describes 4 presences standing before the throne, and among them is the one who stands over the accusers of the inhabitants of the earth and reports all their sins before the Lord. That is a designated position, an office, not a rebel, a prosecutor assigned to the role by the same authority he serves. This is where it gets disturbing. The prosecutorial figure in Enoch is not operating against the divine order. He is operating within it. Chapter 53, verse 3 of the Ethiopian manuscript describes the angels of punishment preparing chains for the assembly of Azazel's followers, and this same figure is present at the sentencing, not as a prisoner, not as a condemned rebel, but as a participant in the legal process that condemns them. Dr. George Nickelsburg, in his 2001 Hermon critical commentary on 1st Enoch, noted specifically that the accuser figure in chapters 40 and 53 occupies a structural role in the divine court that is incompatible with the narrative of a fallen adversary. He is not fallen, he is stationed. The name the text assigns to this figure in a different but related passage is Mastema. 1st Enoch and the closely related Book of Jubilees, which Qumran fragment 4Q216 confirms, shares its manuscript tradition, use the term Mastema to identify the being who leads the spirits of the Nephilim after the flood. Dr. James VanderKam, in his 2001 Eerdmans commentary on the Enochic corpus, analyzed the function of Mastema across both texts and concluded that Mastema occupies a role explicitly authorized by the divine command. After the flood, After the imprisonment of the Watchers, after the destruction of the Nephilim's bodies, the disembodied spirits of those hybrid beings required a commander. Mastema petitioned to retain 1/10 of those spirits for his use. The petition was granted. That is not the narrative of a rebel. That is the narrative of an appointed warden. The distinction the text draws is architectural. The Watchers are imprisoned. 200 beings, named, ranked, bound in fiery chasms beneath the earth at specific locations. Enoch identifies with geographical markers. Their sentence is explicit: detention until the final judgment. Mastema is active, authorized, and operational. Chapter 10 of Jubilees, cross-referenced against the Enochic framework by Dr. VanderKam, records God granting Mastema continued authority over the remaining spirits explicitly so that they will execute divine punishment on human wrongdoing. The being the Church calls Satan, the accuser, the adversary, is in the Enochic text not a rebel against the order, but a designated instrument of it. And then comes the part that shouldn't be possible. The Book of Job, which remained in the biblical canon, preserves exactly this structure without explaining it. The adversary in Job chapters 1 and 2 approaches the divine assembly with the other sons of God. He is not excluded. He is not cast out. He is present. He has access. He reports on human activity. He receives permission before he acts. Not once in those chapters does the text call him fallen, rebel, or enemy of the divine order. He holds a function. He performs it within sanctioned limits. He requires authorization to exceed them. That is the exact structure 1st Enoch preserves in full, with the names, the ranks, and the mechanism the canon removed when Enoch was banned. What the translators left out carries the weight of this entire suppression. The Standard English edition of 1st Enoch, based on R. H. Charles's 1912 Oxford translation and still the baseline for every comparative study that followed, renders the accuser passages in chapters 40 and 53 in ways that flatten the prosecutorial function into something vague and symbolic. But the Ge'ez manuscript at Aksum preserves an additional clause in chapter 40, verse 9, that Charles's edition omits entirely. Dr. Ephraim Isaac confirmed the clause in his 1983 Oxford translation notes, writing that it was excluded from Western editions because it introduces a description of the accuser's authority that implies ongoing active jurisdiction rather than a defeated figure awaiting final sentence. The clause, translated directly from the Ge'ez, reads, "And his authority over the accusers stands until the day of the great judgment, when all accounts are settled before the throne." Present tense. Stands. Not stood, not will stand. Stands. The authority is current. The function is active. The figure the Church has spent 17 centuries describing as a defeated adversary in a cosmic war is described in the oldest recoverable manuscript tradition as an active judicial officer whose mandate runs until the final accounting. That is not a minor translation variance. That is a structural inversion of the entire theological framework the Church built on top of this text after removing it. What modern readers don't realize is how precisely this matches the technical language of the Hebrew legal tradition Enoch was written within. The term ha-Satan appears in the Hebrew Bible at Numbers 22, verse 22, where an angel of God stands as an adversary against Balaam. Same word. Angel of God. Adversary function. No rebellion, no fall. In Zechariah chapter 3, the Satan stands in the divine court as a prosecuting attorney accusing the high priest Joshua. God rebukes the prosecution in that instance, but the accuser is still operating within the court structure, not outside it. Zechariah was written in the 6th century BCE. 1st Enoch, in its oldest recoverable form, was composed no later than the 3rd century BCE. Both texts use the same framework. Neither describes what the Church teaches. The suppression mechanism starts at the Council of Laodicea in 364 CE, but it consolidates later through Jerome and Augustine. Jerome, compiling the Latin Vulgate around 400 CE, chose to translate the Hebrew ha-Satan across multiple contexts as a proper name, Satanas, rather than a title. That decision collapsed the prosecutorial figure, the accuser, the adversary, into a single named rebel. What had been a function with a designated holder became a personality with a biography. Augustine, writing in the City of God around 410 CE, systematized the narrative: pride, rebellion, expulsion, ongoing warfare against humanity. a fallen archangel conducting a cosmic insurgency. That theological construct appears nowhere in 1st Enoch. It appears nowhere in the canonical texts that preserved the prosecutorial framework. It is a construction built from selected verses stripped of the Enochic context that gave them their actual meaning. The Isaiah 14 passage is the critical case. Verses 12 through 15 describe a figure called Hillel ben Shashar, translated in Latin as Lucifer, son of the morning, falling from heaven. Augustine read this as the biography of Satan. The Church built an entire cosmology on that reading. But Isaiah 14 is an oracle against the king of Babylon. The surrounding verses are explicit. Verse 4 states plainly, "You will take up this taunt against the king of Babylon." The fall of Hillel is a poetic metaphor for the collapse of Babylonian imperial power. It has nothing to do with a rebel angel. 1st Enoch, written within 2 centuries of those verses, does not cite Isaiah 14 in any passage describing the accuser, the adversary, or the hierarchy of the watchers. The identification is entirely patristic. It was made by church fathers reading a text outside its original context, after the text that would have corrected them had been removed. The Qumran manuscript evidence makes the gap undeniable. Fragment 4 Q201 names Semjazah. Fragment 4 Q204 records the imprisonment decree for Azazel. Neither fragment nor any of the 9 additional Enoch fragments recovered from Qumran uses a personal name Satan in any passage describing the head of the opposing hierarchy. What they preserve instead is the functional title, the prosecutorial role, and in the passages that address what stands above Semjazah and Azazel, a figure whose authority is described as judicial rather than insurgent. Dr. Florentino Garcia Martinez, cataloging the Qumran fragments in the 1990s, noted that the Enochic texts from Cave 4 consistently portray the cosmic adversarial function as an authorized role within the divine economy, not a rebellion against it. That assessment is based on the oldest recoverable manuscript evidence in existence. The church that removed Enoch preserved Leviticus, and Leviticus 16 preserves the name Azazel untranslated in the Day of Atonement ritual. 2 goats, one for God, one for Azazel. The name sits in the Hebrew text, La Azazel, stripped of the context that 1st Enoch supplies in full. The same removal happened to the adversary function. Jude 1 verse 14, inside the accepted canon, quotes 1st Enoch directly, word for word, from the 7th chapter. The book that was banned is cited verbatim by the book that was kept. The institution that removed one text preserved the other, and the other text contains the quote that proves the removal was selective, not comprehensive. The Enochic framework was known, it was read, it was cited, and then the text that contained it was declared non-canonical and the simplified replacement was installed in its place. What the simplified replacement produced is a theology built on a figure that does not exist in the oldest recoverable sources. The Church teaches a rebel angel, cast from heaven, conducting a war against humanity, defeated in principle but active in practice, destined for final destruction. 1st Enoch teaches a designated accuser, operating within judicial authority, holding a mandate over the spirits of the Nephilim, active until the day of final reckoning, not as an enemy of the order but as a sanctioned instrument of it. The difference is not minor. It changes the entire architecture of what evil is, where it comes from, and what its relationship to divine authority actually means. The Church collapsed 200 named individuals, a structured hierarchy, a named commander, a prosecutorial first, unction, and an authorized adversarial office into one word: Satan. One name, no rank, no mechanism, no origin. The Ethiopian manuscripts at Aksum carry the complete text unredacted. The Qumran fragments at the Shrine of the Book in Jerusalem preserve the Aramaic originals. Anyone with access to Dr. Nibb's 1978 Oxford edition, Dr. Nickelsburg's 2001 Hermon commentary, or Dr. VanderKam's 2001 Eerdmans analysis, can verify the prosecutorial framework independently. The manuscript tradition runs through 2 separate lineages, Aramaic and Ge'ez, with no documented contact between them, and both carry the same structure. The accuser is not a rebel. The adversary holds an office. The figure above the watchers is not conducting an insurgency. The oldest recoverable text says so in precise, non-symbolic language, and the institution that knew this text well enough to ban it spent the next 17 centuries teaching something that the text it banned directly contradicts. The permit to excavate Bab Edra has been denied to every research team since 1924. The Jordanian government classified the site as a restricted natural hazard zone in 1967 following the Six-Day War. The Hebrew University Ground-Penetrating Radar Survey from 2003, published in the journal Geomorphology, detected a subsurface void 800 meters in diameter and at least 600 meters deep directly beneath the formation, described only as a significant anomaly of unknown origin. Dr. Amos Frumkin, the lead geologist on that survey, stated in a 2006 interview that the void's geometric regularity was inconsistent with standard karst formation patterns. No follow-up drilling has been authorized. The text that described the location was removed from the canon in 364 CE. The site it points to has been inaccessible since 1924. The Council of Laodicea's official stated reason for removing Enoch was that it contained too much material about the Watchers, the angels,